Now, there is a scenario, however, in which the US would get dragged in for a different reason. The Iranians know that the objective of the Israelis is to subjugate Iran militarily, turn it into the next Lebanon or Syria, a country that Israel can strike at will with impunity, with no American involvement. That is what the Israelis have succeeded to do with Lebanon, with Syria, and they want to do the same thing with Iran. From their standpoint, for them to be safe, Israel needs to have total security, and all of these other countries can have any security or any deterrence capability vis-a-vis Israel. Given the fact that the Iranians know this, there's a high likelihood that in the next war, instead of pacing their missile attacks as they did in the first war, because they thought it was going to be a long war, that the Iranians this time around will actually attack very strongly and very hard in the very early phases of the war, in order to dispel any notion in Israel that Iran can be turned into the next Lebanon or Syria. And as a result, shoot a large number of missiles early on and try to inflict as much damage and cost on Israel as possible. The only deterrence Iran has at this point is its offensive capability. That could then very likely lead to very high casualty events in Israel, and that will dramatically increase the pressure on the United States to get involved in the war offensively and not just defensively.
You're watching CapitalCOSM. My name is Danny, and my guest today is Trita Parsi. He's the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, who I'm excited to have on the show today. We're going to talk all sorts of geopolitical news and insights. Sir, thank you so much for coming on the show, my friend.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, let's go ahead and dive right in here, Trita. We have so much stuff to get into. It's so little time, but let's go ahead and dive right into Iran. Iran appears to be the first powder keg to blow, first theater or war to blow within weeks, from what I've heard. Are you able to confirm the imminency of a strike on Iran, whether it be by Israel or the United States?
Well, I can't confirm anything, obviously, because I don't know for certain what the plans are. I am certainly of the view that there is a significant likelihood that the Israelis will launch another attack before end of December. I wrote about this already in August, pointing to the fact that they had not achieved all of their objectives, and having started the effort, they cannot afford to stop, because they, from their standpoint, need to keep on bombing Iran before Iran manages to rebuild its air defense systems and perhaps buy better ones or root out the Mossad presence inside the country. The one factor that I think has occurred since I wrote that piece of foreign policy in August is that the Israelis really committed a huge mistake by attacking Qatar. It cost them dearly in Washington, certainly cost them a lot in the region. And this appears to have shifted the balance in the White House away from the direction it was, which was that, Israel had done a successful job in the previous war, and as a result, the US should just keep on supporting them and deferring to them on everything ranging from Syria to Iran to Lebanon to, of course, Gaza. That seems to have changed. I think that the Trump plan that he's put forward is a direct result of the Israeli overreach. And whether that overreach also translates into the Israelis not having the opportunity politically to go forward with an attack on Iran before December remains to be seen. But bottom line is the Israelis cannot attack Iran without significant American support, particularly when it comes to making sure that the many missiles that the Iranians will shoot in retaliations are shot down. And even during the 12-day war, we saw that the Iranians were quite successful in getting quite a few of those missiles through. But without American help, far larger number of them would have gone through, and it would have inflicted significant damage on Israel.
What's the nature of this defense agreement between the United States and Qatar that materialized after that strike on Qatar about a couple of weeks ago from now? I do believe that one of the points that they agreed to was to change the leadership of Al Jazeera to be more, neutral on the Israel-Gaza issue. But what are some of the other details involved with that agreement?
I've not heard that there's been any change at Al Jazeera, and I would be quite skeptical of that, that the Qataris would agree to something like that. They, argue that Al Jazeera is independent and that they don't have that much control over it, which obviously is a bit of a stretch, but nevertheless, the idea that they would change the leadership of that as a result of this, I find unlikely, but I'm happy to be proven wrong on that. On the issue itself, though, I think we should be very clear. There already is an informal agreement between the United States and Qatar. It's not clear to me to what extent this statement by the administration really changed the picture beyond the political signaling that it essentially is saying loud and clear, Israel cannot attack Qatar again. Because that's obviously the main audience for this. But I do think also that at the end of the day, this is a way for the United States to try to calm down some of the other states in the GCC who, for very credible reasons, understandable reasons, are profoundly questioning the value of any American promises at this point. And we saw that, for instance, the Saudis struck a deal with the Pakistanis, which I think to a large extent is a way of signaling the US that Saudi Arabia has other options. And the country behind Pakistan is China. So this was a way of signaling that Saudi Arabia can move closer to China. And they just took a significant step in that direction by doing it with Pakistan, mindful of the fact that so much of Pakistan's weaponry is Chinese. So I think to a certain extent, that is what this is. Whether it actually, in essence, goes beyond what already existed, I think is debatable.
Do you think it's a coincidence that about a day or two after that Saudi-Pakistani agreement was put in place, President Trump, made this call to reacquire Bagram Air Force Base? Or are those two separate things?
Because I think those are a bit separate. And just to be clear on that point, I think this is a huge mistake. I mean, the United States already paid $2 trillion to change the government in Afghanistan from the Taliban back to the Taliban. So the idea that we would go back in or require bases inside of Afghanistan, I think is a very dangerous gamble where instead of doing what Trump claimed that he was going to do to end these endless wars, not get involved in new ones, instead we're seeing an expansion of this web of military bases and the idea that we have to be militarily present everywhere. It is precisely the idea that we have to be militarily present and dominant everywhere that has led to a situation in which we are at war somewhere all the time. So if you actually want to end these wars, you actually have to discipline yourself and start recognizing that a lot of these bases are an overextension of the United States and do not serve our interest.
What do you think was the rationale behind the desire to reacquire Bagram then?
I think it has more to do with China and Iran than it has to do with Saudi Arabia. That base in the first place obviously was something that the United States, when it took it over, had an eye of China. I mean, the fact that the US during the attack on Afghanistan in 2001 was using Central Asian states, etc., was very much something that was also having China in mind. Of course, also having a presence there enables the United States not only to have bases in the Persian Gulf, in Syria and Iraq, on the west and the south of Iran, but also making sure that it has a presence on the east of Iran.
With this Saudi and Pakistani defense agreement in place, is there a chance that Saudi may not allow Israel to utilize its airspace to reach Iran? Could that be why they also want to grab Bagram, to get closer proximity?
Well, certainly it would give the United States closer proximity if the Taliban were then to allow the Israelis to use the base to attack Iran. Obviously, then the Taliban would put Afghanistan in a position of war with Iran itself. The other countries that have bases know very well that if they allow the US to use those bases for an attack on Iran, those bases would be attacked themselves. And we saw that many of these states have not allowed the United States to use bases on their territory for an attack of Iran because they're opposed to such a war. They believe that it will destabilize the region. It will make things much, much more difficult for these states. For the Taliban to do this, I think would be quite a turn of events. And I think the last thing the Taliban needs at this point is a war with Iran.
Mm. And so it kind of begs the question, to what level, if we are to see this, this round two, let's say, between Iran and Israel, to what extent would the United States, force its involvement in here?
So I think there's a minimum involvement, which is the defensive side of it, which is to provide the Israelis with stronger air defense systems, intelligence, etc., and shoot down drones, missiles to the extent that the U.S. can. We saw that under Biden. We saw that under Trump. Now, of course, under Trump, he went further and also provided offensive support by attacking Iran's nuclear facilities himself, something that the Israelis could not do with the same impact, certainly not taking out Fordo. So that is, most likely always going to be the case because, frankly, the Israelis cannot attack Iran without having that support. But it's also something that we should understand. It is that defensive help that enables Israel to go on the offensive. If the United States doesn't want to see this further destabilization, doesn't want to have a scenario that could risk bringing the U.S. much deeper into the war, it's actually pretty easy. You just say no to the Israelis. You cannot do this because we will not provide you with the defensive help that you are in dire need of. So the U.S. has a tremendous amount of leverage. It hasn't used it. The Biden administration essentially pitched it as if that they have used it by only providing defensive support and not supporting him offensively. Well, it's the defensive support that enables Israel to attack in the first place. If you actually don't want to see the attack, you withdraw the defensive support. Now, the United States can go much further, and I think there is a risk that that will happen for a variety of reasons, which is that we have seen that much like Biden, Trump caves to Israeli pressure as well. Now, of course, he has had a stronger track record of saying no to Israel than what Biden has had. But nevertheless, he caved on one of the biggest issues, which was to go to war with Iran with that attack. Now, there is a scenario, however, in which the U.S. would get dragged in for a different reason. The Iranians know that the objective of the Israelis is to subjugate Iran militarily, turn it into the next Lebanon or Syria, a country that Israel can strike at will with impunity, with no American involvement. That is what the Israelis have succeeded to do with Lebanon, with Syria, and they want to do the same thing with Iran. From their standpoint, for them to be safe, Israel needs to have total security, and all of these other countries can have any security or any deterrence capability vis-a-vis Israel. Given the fact that the Iranians know this, there's a high likelihood that in the next war, instead of pacing their missile attacks as they did in the first war, because they thought it was going to be a long war, that the Iranians this time around will actually attack very strongly and very hard in the very early phases of the war, in order to dispel any notion in Israel that Iran can be turned into the next Lebanon or Syria. And as a result, shoot a large number of missiles early on and try to inflict as much damage and cost on Israel as possible. The only deterrence Iran has at this point is its offensive capability. That could then very likely lead to very high casualty events in Israel, and that will dramatically increase the pressure on the United States to get involved in the war offensively and not just defensively.
It's interesting you mentioned the weapons, because Iran has been getting shipments of weapons and fighter jets from, by virtue of Russia and China. How important is Iran as it is today to the Russians and the Chinese? Can Russia and China afford to allow Israel and the United States to regime change Iran? What would be some of the consequences for them?
No, I think it would be very problematic for the Russians and the Chinese. Now, none of them are going to go to war on behalf of Iran. They'll provide weapons, perhaps. And so far, it seems like it's mostly been rumors that the Iranians are buying Russian fighter jets. And even if the history between the two sides is that even if they say that the weapons will be delivered in 2026, most likely they will not be delivered until 2029. So in the short run, it does not appear that at least the Russian support is much to be counted on. At least this is the way the Iranians are seeing it. China is a different matter, of course, but China is also very careful. It does not want to get entangled into any one of these conflicts. The Chinese had offered Iran both air defense systems and fighter jets that the Iranians apparently had turned down back in 2022 or 23. And those systems performed very well in the brief war between Pakistan and India earlier this year. So the Iranians may be looking at that. The question is, how fast can that be done? So it does not appear to me that before the next round of fighting, there will have been a significant degree of change in the sense that the Iranians will have gotten better air defense systems or fighter jets from the Russians or the Chinese to make a huge difference. I think still the one variable that the Iranians are going to be relying on in the next war, when or if Israel attacks, is their ability to inflict damage on Israel through their missile capabilities, which the Israelis have proven themselves not to be fully capable of shooting down. We saw that over the course of the war, the Iranians became increasingly effective in using their missiles, degrading the Israeli air defense systems, and also figuring out how to take advantage of the patches. Now, of course, we have to keep in mind, war is a learning event, and it is not clear who has learned the most since the 12-day war. So by the time the next war starts, a critical question is going to be who has learned the most from the previous war, and as a result has managed to improve both their defenses and their offensive capabilities as a result.
Why did Iran initially turn down the offer from China in 2022 and 2023, like you alluded to?
It's not clear to me as to why they did that. There is, this is speculative on my end. I don't know if this is a key reason for it or not. But there is an element inside of Iran, or a phenomenon inside of Iran, which is Iran is not eager to just rush into the arms of Russia and China. It is looking towards the West. It doesn't mean that it wants to become a vassal of some Western power, or that it wants to rely entirely on the West, but rather it wants to play the same middle power game as Saudi and others are, which is that they want to go in all directions at the same time and put their eggs in many different baskets and not be dependent on any major power. That in and of itself is not an answer as to why they declined. But it is a factor that there was a lot of criticism inside of Iran when the Rouhani government signed the 25-year strategic collaboration agreement with the Chinese, which doesn't even have a military dimension, but it was a lot of criticism against it internally for having done so, giving up Iran's sovereignty, et cetera, et cetera. So those factors may have been at play when it comes to Iran's reluctance to go over to that type of a system from the Chinese. I think we should also keep one thing in mind. Back in 1994-95, when the US first started to severely sanction Iran, this is during the Clinton administration, there was an argument in the media being made at the time that if Iran is sanctioned and pushed away from Western economies by the United States itself through these sanctions, because this is at a moment when the Iranians were eagerly reaching out to the US. They had even offered a major oil contract to ConocoOil, the first oil contract after the nationalization of their oil industry during the revolution was deliberately granted to an American company because of a desire on the Iranian side to actually improve relations with the US. That actually prompted the US to start sanctioning Iran much more. Clinton killed that deal with 2 executive orders, and under tremendous pressure from pro-Israeli groups and from Israel itself, it started sanctioning Iran. There was an argument at the time in the media that said, if we go down this path, we will push Iran into the arms of Russia and China. And looking back 30 years later, that argument was absolutely correct. Iran is much closer, reluctantly, of China and Russia than it was 30 years ago. And it is to a very large extent because of the sanctions policy and, by and large, the refusal of the West to engage with or make an arrangement with Iran and then sticking to it. As we saw, Obama did it, but Trump pulled out of it.
Hey guys, let's take a quick break to talk about today's sponsor, MindWalk. Ticker symbol HYFT on the NASDAQ and formerly known as immunoprecise antibodies. Now, if you've been watching the biotech and AI space, you know there's been a huge push towards using AI to revolutionize drug discovery. That's exactly what MindWalk is doing. They're combining cutting-edge AI with deep scientific expertise to develop next-gen therapies faster and more efficient than ever before. MindWalk has been making some big moves recently. They just divested their European contract research business so they can sharpen their focus on their AI-driven drug discovery platform. In other words, they're doubling down on what makes them unique, using powerful machine learning to accelerate the identification and development of novel drugs. Even more exciting, MindWalk announced advances in their AI-discovered and AI-developed antibodies that are designed to tackle some of the toughest challenges in medicine. This is where things get really interesting because We're talking about a company leveraging AI not just as a buzzword, but as a true engine for creating therapies that could change lives. In a world where drug development can take over a decade and cost billions of dollars, MindWalk is aiming to completely shift that paradigm by streamlining discovery and targeting precision. They're positioning themselves at the forefront of one of the biggest revolutions in healthcare. So you want to keep an eye on an innovative company that's harnessing AI to reshape biotech. Definitely take a closer look at MindWalk. That's ticker symbol HYFT on the NASDAQ. All right, guys, let's get back to the video. It's interesting you mentioned this kind of proclivity of Iran to want to be more, not cozy, but more friendly to the West, even though that hasn't materialized, ever, just because of the constant antagonism of the West. But isn't that more of an issue of different factional disputes internally in Iran? Because you mentioned the Rouhani, Rouhani party, I believe it's the Reformist Party, which is now, the head is Pezeshkian. They were more favorable towards mending ties with the Europeans and America and so forth. But after Rouhani, you had Raisi. And it was under Raisi where you started to see more closeness and more ties begin to develop between Russia and China. Is Iran on one page currently, or are there still significant differences within the different factions internally within Iran?
You're quite right to point out that the issue has been, and has for a long time, of course, been politicized. There's always been that tension about outreach to the United States. 30 years ago, you could not even argue publicly in Iran for dialogue with the United States. It was a taboo, and incidentally, it was a taboo in the United States as well. Those taboos were broken, but there was a lot of resistance from hardliners who were very worried that if there actually was a rapprochement between the United States and Iran, American influence inside of Iran would grow, American businesses would come in, and eventually, over time, the grip of power of the hardliners would be diluted and weakened. And that this is a key reason as to why they opposed it and ended up actually favoring an orientation towards China. And for a very similar reasons, the reformists were then opposed to just putting all of the eggs in the Chinese and the Russian basket, because they saw that as something that the hardliners calculated would help them retain control over the country. So it has become politicized. It's part of the political football, as is, unfortunately the case in most countries, that these issues that are of strategic significance become politicized and become political footballs. Now, going to what you said, yes, during the Raisi years, they very much went in that direction. And it's quite clear that it really didn't pay off that well for the Iranians. I mean, the Iranians would have been much better off if multipolarity had happened 20 years ago. But it is not happening fast enough for them. And yes, they're now part of the SCO. They're part of BRICS. But can they rely on just these countries to be able to circumvent American sanctions? Right now, it's essentially just Russia and China that are trading with Iran. Other countries that may be very opposed to these sanctions and may not be on the same page as the United States geopolitically, nevertheless, are in a position in which they're not willing to go against the American sanctions because of the economic cost and political cost it will have for them. And when you take a look at the growth of Iran's economy and you compare it, for instance, to Turkey, I mean, Turkey had a smaller economy than Iran in 2000, and now has, I think, 3 times the size of Iran. So over time, these sanctions are devastating Iran's trajectory and its ability to grow. And just relying on Russia and China does not appear to be a winning strategy.
Understood. Now, as we look ahead towards this probable war between Iran and Israel, one of the key assets that Iran lost over the last couple of years was Syria. You had Iran, Iraq to an extent, Syria, Lebanon, kind of formed a wall leading up to the Mediterranean. Is the axis of resistance, which has been affiliated with Iran, is that still one cohesive group, or has it been relegated to just pockets of resistance instead?
So the loss of Syria, of course, was tremendously damaging to Iran. The weakening of Hezbollah certainly as well. And this is also part of the reason why the Israelis did choose to attack at this moment, and why I think Trump eventually agreed to it as well, given the fact that earlier on, all American presidents from George Bush all the way to Trump 1 and Biden had rejected Israeli pressure to actually take military action against Iran. But the weakening of Hezbollah, in particular, and the loss of Syria, really made Iran much more vulnerable. In many ways, those were the outward defenses of Iran. It was Iran's retaliatory capability. Had Hezbollah been in the same shape as it was in 2022, for instance, and the Israeli had attacked Iran, there would have been massive retaliation coming in from Lebanon itself, which would have been very costly to the Israelis given the proximity, of course. And we're talking about a situation in which Hezbollah likely would have used much more effective and advanced missiles than the ones that we have seen them use recently. So this really made Iran much, much more vulnerable. And there was an understanding to a larger extent in the Iranian public, who by and large had oftentimes been critical of Iran's regional policy. Why is this all investment in Lebanon and in Syria? I mean, Assad was not a popular figure in many parts of Iran, given what he was doing himself. But now I think a lot of folks have come to the conclusion that as much as they may not like it, nevertheless, in the absence of those forward defenses, Iran was much more vulnerable and the war would come to Iran's own territory, which is exactly what happened. And you saw these massive attacks on by the Israelis all over the country, all the way to the east of the country, the Israelis were striking. So I think there's a different attitude right now in the sense that there is a need for a more effective Axis, perhaps, because the Axis did not perform for the Iranians, and Iran did not perform for the Axis when Lebanon was attacked, for instance. Whether they can rebuild that in time, etc., remains to be seen. But I think what is clear is that the conclusion in Tehran is not, oh, this was a foolish strategy, let's do something else. No, the conclusion is it needs to be rebuilt, but it needs to be rebuilt much, much better than it was before, because Iran doesn't have a lot of other options.
And to what extent will the Axis be activated should Iran find itself in another war in a couple of weeks or whenever they do find their?
I find it unlikely that the Axis is in a position right now to be activated if there is another attack. And this is exactly why, again, it is from the Israeli standpoint very, very beneficial to strike soon enough. Because if Iran is given enough time to rebuild its defenses, rebuild the Axis, etc., the calculation will be very different. The United States will likely be much more hesitant. So now is the moment for the Israelis from their standpoint. And I think the window starts closing in December, because that's when the United States essentially enters the midterm election season. It's not prohibitive, but it makes it more complicated. And it makes it more difficult to convince Trump what direction to go in. And again, as I said earlier on, Israel cannot do any of this without the support of the United States. So it's not as if the Israelis just decide to go at it alone. They could, but then they'll get hit really, really hard by the Iranians without the proper way of being able to shoot down those incoming missiles. So the US has tremendous leverage. Whether we use it or not is the question. And I think we are constantly being let down by politicians who make promises of exiting these endless wars, not starting new wars, but then yet again getting pushed into them, in this case by Israel. Because the United States under Trump consumed 25% of all of its THAAD interceptors in a region that 3 presidents in a row have said is no longer vital to US interests. So why are we doing it?
Mm. And to kind of wrap it up, recently, Iran's been making these overtures to Sunni neighbors, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the various Gulf states, to form some sort of coalition. How successful can something like that be? I mean, where do you anticipate these, the likes of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, et cetera, falling when they've got to choose between allowing Israel or the United States to use their airspace, or and vice versa? How do you, which direction will they end up falling? Because the likes of Turkey, they've made a lot of rhetoric against Israel, but it hasn't really been followed by too much action. So it kind of begs the question: is it just red meat for the population, or is it something else?
No, I think that point is very, very valid. And I think we see a situation in which many of them may want to turn to Turkey as one of the countries with a stronger defense industry to be able to provide them with some degree of protection. Turkey has already essentially done that for Qatar, but that was against a Saudi and Emirati attack, not against an Israeli attack. If Turkey were to step up, which I doubt that it will, to provide some sort of a protection for states in the region, adopt a position of some sort of a regional hegemon and defend them against Israel, it means that Turkey itself puts itself in the direct line of fire of Israel. And what we have seen so far is exactly what you said. A lot of rhetoric from the Turkish side, but ultimately very careful not to put itself in the direct line of fire of Israel. Because the Turks believe, and they are probably right, that if they were to be attacked by Israel as a result of this or some other phenomenon, that NATO would not come to its defenses against Israel. And it's difficult to envision that NATO actually would. Could you see the United States coming in on the side of Turkey in a war between Turkey and Israel? It has a NATO obligation towards Turkey. It does not have any treaty obligation towards Israel. But the political reality is something completely different. So I don't see the Turks stepping up. I think what you're going to end up seeing is that there's going to be a game of pretense. The United States is going to pretend that it is still providing some degree of protection for these GCC states. The GCC states are going to pretend that they're still trusting that arrangement. But in reality, the US is withdrawing. It is not going to go to war on their behalf against Iran or against Israel. And these states are going to start putting their eggs in a lot of different baskets, whether it's a Saudi-Pakistani arrangement or other types of arrangements, but none of them at the level of saying that this is some sort of a security guarantee or that it is a defense pact, but a lot of different webs because they have to hedge. They cannot trust the American security umbrella. They cannot rely on any other state stepping in. They don't want to have such an arrangement with Iran. Turkey is not interested ultimately to provide that type of arrangement. So instead, there's going to be a lot of smaller arrangements that will grow. And over time, perhaps that will grow into something bigger. But you're not going to see any of these states declaring that they're no longer relying on American protection. They will pretend, US will pretend, but behind the scenes, there will be a different reality.
Understood. Well, it's been a pleasure, my friend. I know you have a heart out here. Thank you so much for your time. Where can people find you if they want to see more of your work?
So they should go to my organization, which is the Quincy Institute, quincyinst.org. They can go to my personal website, tritaparsi.com. I put all of my stuff out on Twitter, which is tparsi, and my Substack, which is also Trita Parsi.
All right. We'll have the links to all those down below. So check them out, guys. If you got value out of this podcast, drop us a like and comment. Try to go in the comment section. If you agreed or disagreed, let me know. I do, in fact, read all the comments, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss an episode. Liking, subscribing, commenting, all that stuff goes a long way in helping push this video in the algorithm. And and subscribe on Substack as well to help support the channel monetarily at capitalcosm.substack.com. Thanks for watching, guys. Catch you later. Bye.
Thank you so much for having me as well. Thank you.